Maybe I could start with a quotation from Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor. And in writing and reflecting about his experience, Frankl said, "If we present a man with a concept of man which is not true, we may well corrupt him. When we present man as an automaton of reflexes, as a mind machine, as a bundle of instincts, as a pawn of drives and reactions, as a mere product of instinct, heredity, and environment, we feed the nihilism to which modern man is, in any case, prone. I became acquainted," Frankl continued, "with the last stage of that corruption in my second concentration camp, Auschwitz. The gas chambers of Auschwitz were the ultimate consequence of the theory that man is nothing but the product of heredity and environment, as the Nazis like to say, of blood and soil. I'm absolutely convinced that the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek were ultimately prepared not in some ministry or other in Berlin, but rather at the desks and lecture halls of nihilistic scientists and philosophers." So Frankl was arguing that these deterministic ideas about humans, that is, that humans are just determined by their biology, their heredity, or by their environment, that these are the things that had corrupted humanity and led to this widespread mass destruction in the Holocaust. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And in fact, I make that same argument, of course, in my own book, The Death of Humanity. And I'm not the first person to make these points. This point's been made quite perspicaciously by C.S. Lewis in his book, The Abolition of Man. It was a very short book, but it makes a very powerful point about these same kind of issues. Also, if you look at C.S. Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength, he portrays some of these same issues about treating humans as just something to be manipulated because they're just the product of external forces and such, without any distinct personality or free will or anything like that. Francis Schaeffer also did a lot of critiques along this lines. One of the more interesting ones, I think, on this particular issue is his book Back to Freedom and Dignity, which was arguing against B.F. Skinner's kind of behavior psychology and the notion that humans are just the product of our environment and so we can manipulate them however we want. So there's many other thinkers as well. I mean, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example, Viktor Frankl I talked about was a Holocaust survivor, so he was talking about the Nazi side of it. Alexander Solzhenitsyn has looked at the communist atrocities that have been committed and critiqued this communist vision of humanity, which was based upon an environmental determinism of their time. So as I reflect back on intellectual history, I've looked at, in my book, Death of Humanity, I look at these secular philosophies and try to look at how they have viewed humanity. What have they said about the value of humanity? What have they said about the dignity of humanity? And I find it interesting that many secular philosophies over the past couple of centuries, since the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, have called their philosophies humanism. I mean, you've probably heard of the Humanist Manifesto and such, but if you look at many other secular philosophies have made similar kinds of claims. And part of the reason they call themselves humanism is because they reject God. And so because they reject God, they claim that they are thus exalting humans and setting up humans to be the arbiters of their own destinies. We can make our own way. We don't have to have religion or God or something else interfering. So they then call this humanism and claim that they're exalting humanity. One of the problems, of course, is that according to Jesus' own words, that he who exalts himself will be abased. And this is exactly what we see happening with these kinds of these humanistic ideas that have been promoted. And when I say humanistic, I'm not just talking about what is known as secular humanism per se. I'm talking about all these humanistic philosophies over the past couple of centuries. They end up with humans becoming nothing because they essentially undermine the notion that humans have any moral significance or moral responsibility or any kind of value or significance beyond what we just give to ourselves. So they really strip humanity of dignity, and they do end up debasing humans. It's interesting that many secular thinkers have themselves admitted that their philosophies end up demoting humans. So if we think of, say, Peter Singer, who, there we go. Peter Singer, here's my slide showing a couple of his books that are out there. Peter Singer says that he wants to unsanctify human life, as in the book there on the left. And in the book on the right, they're Rethinking Life and Death, the Collapse of Our Traditional Ethics. Of course, Singer is talking, when he uses the word traditional ethics, he's talking about Judeo-Christian ethics, and that he wants to collapse. He's thinking this is a good thing, that we need to rethink life and death and strip humanity of their centrality that he thinks humanity is given too much attention by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so he doesn't want us to be considered as sanctified any longer. The biologist Richard Dawkins makes similar kind of arguments about wanting to desanctify human life and get us to stop thinking that human life is, created in the image of God and has some kind of value and significance because of that reason. There's also been quite a number of secular thinkers over the last couple of centuries who have blasted Christianity for its what they call anthropocentric view of the world. Anthropocentric, of course, comes from the idea of anthro meaning human, so anthropo meaning human, so human-centered. Now, of course, by the way, I should say that I don't actually agree with them that the Christian worldview is anthropocentric, because I think it's theocentric. I think it's centered on God. It's not centered on us. But nonetheless, because Christianity teaches, and Judaism also, that humans are created in the image of God, it does see humans as having a value and moral significance above the rest of the creatures. Here we can see this slide I have up now is from Ernst Haeckel, the leading German Darwinist. It's from his book Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte, which means Natural History of Creation, his 1911 edition. This is one of his best-selling books, and this is a painting of what's supposed to be some missing link. It's really an imaginary rendition of what a missing link would be. And Haeckel was very forthright in criticizing what he called the anthropocentric view of humans, because he thought it was just arbitrary, the barrier between the species and the difference between humans and apes. And so there were these half humans, half apes, or half simian creatures that preceded humans. And so that means that humans really don't have any particular significance that in any kind of real sense. We're just a little bit slightly different than, of course, the apes, but not any qualitative kind of distinction there. And by the way, Darwin actually made that same remark, that there's a quantitative difference between humans and apes. That is, we have just a little more rationality, just a little more aesthetic sense, just a little more social instinct and such, but there's no qualitative difference between them. Several years ago, a University of Texas biologist raised a minor ruckus when he argued against the anthropocentric view. And he used that term anthropocentrism that he was fighting against. And this particular biologist named Eric Pianka suggested that it would be a good thing if 90% of the human population would be wiped off the globe. Now, he wasn't saying that he was wanting to do that. Here I have a couple slides showing this there. The slide on the left showing an article talking about doomsday. UT professor says death is imminent for most humans because he has this view that he believes that the human population is way too big and needs to be scaled way, way, way back because we're beyond our carrying capacity for the human population on the globe. But he actually is rooting for that decimation and destruction. It's not just that he's saying that, oh yeah, it's going to happen, and he laments it. He thinks it'd be a good thing if humans, at least 90% of them, were wiped off the globe because of his views about the evils of anthropocentrism and such that he sees as a problem. Now, there have been two main philosophical movements that have, it seems to me, brought about or helped bring about, give impetus toward this devalue of human life that's taken place over the past couple of centuries. One of these is materialism or atheism, which are basically identical. Materialism is the belief that all that exists in the universe is matter and energy. And materialism was going to first emerge in an intellectual context in the 18th century. In the 1740s, there was a famous French philosopher named Julien de la Mettrie. He wasn't an academic philosopher, but a sort of amateur philosopher. He was a physician, actually, who wrote a book called Man the Machine. And in his book, Man the Machine, he argued that man is simply a machine, and everything in the world operates according to mechanistic principles, and everything is just matter in motion. And thus, he argued that humans have no souls, and humans have no free will. Everything is determined by either your biology or by your environment, one or the other, or some combination of the two. And after the time of de la Mettrie, materialism was going to gain ground, especially in the 19th century. In the 18th century, it was still a pretty small movement, even among intellectuals. In the 19th century, it was going to gain ground considerably, and was going to contribute to this devaluing of human life, as we see when I'm going to talk about some of the issues we go on going forth from here. The other key movement that was going to emerge, and this one more in the 19th century, was known as positivism, or sometimes we could maybe call this agnosticism. But when we use the word agnosticism, what we mean here is a very hardcore form of agnosticism. That is, sometimes we use the word agnosticism sort of loosely to mean just someone who doesn't believe doesn't know what they believe, I'm not sure if God exists, I'm not sure of this, I'm not sure of that. But the word agnosticism was originally coined in the 19th century, and as I'm using it here to describe this movement known as positivism, means the idea that I don't know if God exists and you don't know either, because it is impossible to know whether God exists. So it's a hard form of agnosticism that says that it's in principle impossible to know whether God exists. And positivism claimed that science was the only path to real knowledge. And so anything outside of scientific knowledge is simply unknowable. We can't know whether it exists or not. So the way this is different from materialism is that the positivists would say, we don't know if God exists. We can't know if God exists. The materialists, on the other hand, say, we do know and God doesn't exist. That's the materialist position. So the positivists are claiming that only science is knowable, and really, in terms of their treatment of humanity, both the positivists and the materialists sort of end up on the same page, because they both think that there's no other kind of input into humans other than what is material input. Again, it has to be scientifically tractable for the positivists. So the only way we can know anything about humans is if we can scientifically figure it out. So both of these movements, materialism and positivism, we're going to embrace determinism, the view that humans are just puppets. We're controlled by either biology or the environment or some combination of the two. Interestingly, many materialists or positivists would sort of focus on one or the other. Either some would focus more on biology and thus became known as biological determinists. Some would focus more on the environment and thus would be environmental determinists. But in any case, they believed that everything was determined by antecedent causes. And this was ultimately going to strip humanity of any kind of moral agency or moral responsibility. And many secular thinkers are quite upfront about this. Richard Dawkins did an interesting spoof based on a Basil Fawlty little skit that he proposed, where this person, when their car can't start, they take out a tree branch and start bashing the car because it won't start. And the point is that they are trying to, see the car as a moral agent with moral responsibility, so they're trying to get it to act right. And Dawkins says, this is what we do when we punish individuals for their moral actions, because he says, instead of trying to investigate what's wrong in the motor, which is what the Basel faulty should have done, he ends up beating it. So he says, that's what we do. We punish people by throwing them in jail or, whatever we do to try to punish people. We're acting as though they have moral responsibility when Dawkins says, no, there's just something messed up in their biological makeup or something, and we just need to correct that in them. And so, again, he completely denies it any kind of moral agency. Now, let me go then and talk about how these two forms, biological determinism and environmental determinism, have emerged over the past couple of centuries to ultimately strip humans of their value and dignity. Biological determinism, which was going to go back all the way to Delametre, whom I mentioned earlier in the 18th century. Delametre was a biological determinist. Nonetheless, biological determinism didn't become really strong as an intellectual movement until the late 19th century. And one of the key figures in this was Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Darwin and is considered the leader of the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a movement to engineer human heredity. And Galton published a book in 1869 called Hereditary Genius. And he argued that genius of various sorts, whether it be artistic genius or mental acuity or all musical talent and such, that it's all based on heredity. And Darwin followed suit and actually embraced Galton's ideas. And in his book, The Descent of Man, which came out 2 years later in 1871, Darwin argued that many character traits are biologically innate. So things like loyalty, thrift, diligence, or on the negative side, deceitfulness, laziness. He saw these things as being biologically innate. They're not just something that's shaped by your upbringing or something. They're in your character, in your biological character. And the eugenics movement that was going to emerge on the basis of Darwin, and in fact, Galton actually said that he came up with the idea of eugenics while he was reading Darwin's Origin of Species. That's even before The Descent of Man came out. And many other eugenicists were very devoted Darwinists and basing their views on what they saw as biological evolution. The eugenics movement was going to promote biological determinism in a very big way. And one of the things that was going to happen as a result of that was they were going to see some humans as biologically superior and some humans as biologically inferior. And so here's a slide showing you, this is from the American eugenics movement, a display that was put in a lot of state fairs, county fairs back in the early 20th century, sponsored by the American Eugenics Society. And on the left side, it says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And this notion of people being burdens, economic burdens and such, was going to be featured very prominently in the eugenics movement. And then on the bottom, it has these flashing lights, 4 flashing lights on the bottom, 1 on the top. But what's interesting is that the flashing lights are supposed to represent people being born with different hereditary abilities. And the flashing light on the right, the bottom right, flashes every 7.5 minutes. And according to that, it says that this is when every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States. And so we get this discrepancy between these so-called high-grade people. And then on the left side, you have a light flashing every 48 seconds, which says if every 48 seconds a person is born in the United States who will never grow up mentally beyond the stage of a normal 8-year-old boy or girl. And so this display itself is pernicious from the start because it's claiming that some people have more value than others. Some people are high grade. Some people are presumably low grade. They don't use that term there, but they're talking about people who they see as essentially inferior. And they do use the word burden there in the display. And if you read a lot of the eugenics literature, you'll find a lot of times them using the words inferior, burden, parasitic. They use these words, very horrifying words to describe various people who they considered intellectually and even morally superior, because again, they think moral traits are biologically inherent as well. And so, by the way, these flashing lights here are supposed to sort of get you, sort of arouse your fear that, ooh, the wrong people are reproducing. The bad, the negative, the inferior people, they're the ones reproducing, and these, good or superior people are the ones who are not having enough kids. And so that was one of the big lessons, messages, I should say, of the eugenics movement and flowing out of this idea of biological determinism. Now, to be sure, many of them were not recommending killing people, although some were. There were elements of the eugenics movement that were promoting infanticide and euthanasia for people who they deemed to be inferior. And of course, the Nazis were going to actually practice that during the Third Reich. Most of the people in the eugenics movement, however, were promoting control of reproduction. So things like compulsory sterilization for those who are identified as so-called unfit. And the word unfit was used quite a bit also relating to people who they considered inferior. Also at the same time as the eugenics movement, the scientific racist movement was gaining a lot of steam, and especially by the 1890s and in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. The scientific racists were going to claim, of course, that certain races are superior and others are inferior. And Darwin was going to advance that idea himself in The Descent of Man, claiming that some races were not only intellectually superior or inferior, but also morally inferior. And Darwin believed that those races were locked in an inescapable struggle for existence as he describes it in The Descent of Man. And in the 1890s and early 20th century, most anthropologists and most biologists embraced scientific racism. Here's a frontispiece from Ernst Haeckel's 1868 book, Natürliche Schöpfungsgeschichte. I showed you a later edition earlier, but this is the original edition that came out in 1868. And you can see he has this diagram showing six races of humans. And by the way, Haeckel actually did call them different species. He called these six different species of humans. And then 6 different species of simians. And if you look at the number 1, which is supposed to be the European at the top, and then look down at number 6, there's 6 steps going from number 1 to number 6. And if you look at number 6, which is supposed to be a human race, and number 7, which is supposed to be a simian species, you notice they look almost identical except for a little more hair on the simian species. And this was intentional. And by the way, Haeckel was a very accomplished artist, so he was very good at artwork, and he specifically drew these as close as possible as he could to make the message, which he also, by the way, put in the caption to this illustration, which was that the difference between the highest human, which is number 1, and the lowest human, which is number 6, that difference is greater than the difference between the lowest human, number 6, and the highest ape species, number 7. So in other words, he's saying number 6 is pretty close to an ape, and number 1 is a lot distant from number 6. So the idea here is that some races are much superior. And again, Haeckel also used the word species to describe different human races, to try to show how distinct he thought they were. And he was not the only one that did that, although not all scientific racists made that particular move. Now, while materialism had reduced humans to just a machine, Darwinism reduced humans to just an animal, and again tried to push some human races to being very close to animals. And Darwin explained that morality, he thought, had arisen also through naturalistic processes. And so as Frankl suggested, and I have also written about quite widely in my own works, from Darwin, a book From Darwin to Hitler, then I had a book out called Hitler's Ethic that looks at Hitler's ideas about social Darwinism and evolutionary ethics. Hitler's worldview was shaped by biological determinism. That's a very central idea of Hitler, that humans are shaped by their biology. And Hitler was going to embrace these notions of social Darwinism. Here's a slide showing you a saying by Adolf Hitler. This is published in a book about Christmas, interestingly, in 1944. And in that, Hitler says, all of nature is a violent struggle between power and weakness, an eternal victory of the strong over the weak. And so Hitler saw humans as being locked in the struggle for existence. And he thought the superior races should destroy the inferior races in that struggle that was going on. And by the way, in that Christmas book, there's nothing about Jesus or about anything. There's stuff about social Darwinism. There's stuff about, kitschy things about family and celebrating with Christmas trees and other things, but nothing about Jesus there. Here's another slide showing you the Nazi view. and this one even more pernicious, the elimination of the sick and weak in nature, it says at the top of this poster. And this is a poster, by the way, supposed to be used in biology classes in schools in Germany in the 1930s. And then at the bottom it says, whatever does not meet the demands of existence is destroyed. And notice by destroyed, they're being killed, interestingly. So even though this poster was being in German schools and was supposed to promote compulsory sterilization, it actually was promoting killing, which the Nazis weren't going to introduce until a little bit later during under the cover of World War II, when they did begin killing people with disabilities. Hitler, along with many other biological determinists, believed that ethics had evolved, and Hitler believed that he was promoting evolutionary progress by trying to destroy those who he saw as both intellectually inferior, but also as morally inferior. He thought he was actually going to make the human species more moral by destroying those that he identified as immoral, like the Jews. Okay, so that's where biological determinism has led. Environmental determinism, the idea that we're determined primarily by our environment, by our upbringing, our education, was also a very prominent idea. In fact, it was probably even stronger in the 19th century than was biological determinism, certainly by the early to mid-19th century. But it has also led to dehumanizing ideas. Marxism and many forms of socialism are built upon environmental determinism. Karl Marx thought that humans were subject to immutable economic and social laws, and he called his views scientific socialism. He believed that human nature and morality were built upon the economic conditions. And so we're determined, according to Marx, we are determined by the economic structure and conditions of society. While Marx was wanting to end oppression and bring about human freedom, we don't usually associate Marxist regimes with freedom. And why is that? Well, I would argue it's because his view of human nature was defective, along with the views of Chairman Mao, Lenin, Castro, and others who've also had very repressive regimes. They all thought that if they just got the economic system right, that would magically transform humans to be cooperative and such. But the problem is they didn't reckon with the fact that everything's not determined by the economic system. And so they ended up promoting oppressive regimes, trying to get people to respond to this environmental inputs that didn't happen there. So environmental determinism hasn't necessarily produced bliss and utopia either. Interestingly, in the last century and a half, there's also been the emergence of another powerful movement, anti-determinist. And I want to say just a little bit about that because it also has brought about dehumanizing views, it seems to me. And that's the views of Nietzsche and various of his followers that sometimes are known as existentialists, and then more recently, postmodernists who embrace many of Nietzsche's kinds of ideas. Nietzsche was wanting to break with determinism by claiming that humans have radical free will. And so basically, we can shape who we are. He thought that humans are not defined by their biology, they're not defined by their upbringing or education or by any kind of moral codes or anything like that. He thought we can decide who we want to become. And so this notion became known as existentialism. On the left side, we see his book, Beyond Good and Evil, because he thought that morality is just constructed by humans. And so we can create our own morality. We don't have to live within the moral codes that are traditional in society. In the book on the right, The Will to Power, he thought that will was paramount, not reason, not logic, not science. And so he's going to break with determinism, these two key ideas that I've talked about. But he also is going to reject religion and God, of course. He's going to have his famous saying that, God is dead and such. And he believed that because of that, anything's possible. Because of that, we can shape our own reality. We can define what is truth. And in fact, he thought all knowledge and all truth is constructed by humans. Now, I almost use the word socially constructed, and maybe there's a sense in which he would say that's true. But Nietzsche was actually not so interested in society constructing morality as he was in the dominant individuals, because he's very individualistic in his thinking, the so-called supermen or Übermensch, sometimes translated overman. He was interested in them having freedom to dominate and control. So on the one hand, Nietzsche's talking about freedom But just like with the Marxists, just like with the fascists and Nazis, it's only freedom for a few, because Nietzsche only wants the Übermensch, the Superman figures. They're the only ones who really are supposed to ultimately, or will ultimately wield freedom, and they are supposed to dominate and oppress the masses. And Nietzsche's very upfront about this. Nietzsche's very upfront about saying that these particular creative individuals should form a sort of intellectual aristocracy, which is going to dominate and oppress the masses. Nietzsche had complete contempt for the masses. He also had contempt for women, by the way. He was very misogynistic, and looked at the women and masses as someone to dominate and control. And that's exactly what he was calling for his Superman figures to do. So this is part of the reason why Nietzsche was going to be speaking out against morality, and especially Judeo-Christian morality. Nietzsche very forthrightly condemned an ethics of love and compassion. Nietzsche thought love and compassion are horrible. What we really need is dominance, strength, power, and again, the will to power. So you want to dominate and control and oppress various people. Now, Nietzsche's ideas were going to resonate very widely in intellectual circles, and was going to form what first became known as the existentialist movement in the early 20th century. And one of the most famous philosophers of the entire 20th century, Martin Heidegger, was going to be following Nietzsche's lead in embracing the idea that humans are creating themselves, that there's no ultimate beyond humanity, and so we just shape our own destiny and create our own morality and such. Heidegger, interestingly, ended up joining the Nazi Party and lauding and praising Hitler in the 1933 after Hitler came to power, and he was then named by the Nazis as rector, which is equivalent of president of the University of Freiburg, where he was. Another philosopher, though, and literary figure to follow Nietzsche's lead in the mid of the 20th century was Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher. Sartre argued quite forthrightly that life is absurd. That was one of his main dicta. Life is absurd. And so life has no meaning, life has no purpose, and so one has to just freely choose what you want as your meaning or your purpose. And so basically you could choose whatever you wanted, again, based on your own will. There's nothing to arbitrate for you. He didn't think there's any moral code outside. No, you shouldn't look to society to try to figure out what you should be doing. You just make your own free choice, and it's ultimately your choice is absurd. No matter what choice you make, your choice is absurd. Interestingly, in terms of politics, Sartre made a choice for communism. Sartre called himself a Marxist, even though he was not an orthodox Marxist, because an existentialist can't be an orthodox Marxist, because there's some tensions between the environmental determinism of Marx and the radical free will view of the existentialists. But he called himself a communist, and in fact, he even supported Stalin very heavily and promoted us and believed that Stalin was a wonderful political leader in the middle of the 20th century. In fact, before 1956, there were a lot of French thinkers that were promoting Marxism and Stalin and such. So we have this interesting situation where Heidegger promotes Nazism, Sartre promotes communism, including Stalinism, and both of them say that life's absurd, you can choose whatever you want. Well, yeah, they chose whatever they wanted, and we ended up with these dehumanizing philosophies that they chose. And there are people today who will say, well, we can still study Heidegger, we can still study Sartre, and especially Heidegger. Heidegger is still pretty popular as an intellectual in intellectual circles today. And it doesn't necessarily lead to Nazism. And I would say, well, yeah, that's right. It doesn't necessarily lead to Nazism. And Sartre's philosophy doesn't necessarily lead to Stalinism either. But what I would also point out is it doesn't give us any defenses against Stalinism or against Nazism. And that should be a problem. I mean, we should be thinking that this is a problem. Why is it that Heidegger, one of the most famous and influential philosophers of the 20th century didn't have anything in his own philosophy that would stop him from embracing Hitler and to promoting Hitler and Hitler's ideology, or promoting anti-Semitism. Heidegger actually pushed the Jews out of the University of Freiburg while he was there, and he was anti-Semitic in various ways, even though he later tried to backpedal on a number of things. So I'd argue, yes, look, these are dehumanizing philosophies. They have a false picture of humanity that doesn't necessarily lead to Nazism, doesn't necessarily lead to Stalinism, but it can lead to those things. And even if it doesn't lead to those, it can lead to other dehumanizing philosophies that we could have today. Indeed, many people, many intellectuals today who follow what's called postmodernism are also essentially following Nietzsche's approach. Sometimes they're placing greater stress on social construction of reality than on individual construction like Nietzsche did. Nietzsche was more focused on the individual. Postmodernists tend to be focused more on social construction of reality. But still, there's this notion that, we can create our own reality. There's no fixed morality. It's all relative and such. So they're still following Nietzsche's approach to a very large degree. And in my book, Death of Humanity, I write quite extensively about the postmodernists, especially Michel Foucault, who's one of the darlings of many intellectuals today, who was promoting very heavily things like homosexuality. He himself was a homosexual. He was promoting drug use. He wanted to promote this great pleasurable thrill that he hoped would be what he called a limit experience. He was also promoting suicide, and I detail this a good deal in my book, since my book is Death of Humanity, is dealing with issues of bioethics and value of humanity and such. And Foucault was promoting suicide. And although he didn't commit suicide himself, he ended up dying of AIDS, which, interestingly enough, Foucault actually, when the AIDS epidemic first hit, he was suspicious. He thought it was socially constructed, that the power elites were, manufacturing this AIDS epidemic to sort of oppress homosexuals and such. Ultimately, of course, he died of AIDS himself. He found that it was not socially constructed, that there is a reality that he had to reckon with, and that reality came to bring about his demise and destruction. So what are the implications then of these dehumanizing ideologies that I've talked about here? Well, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but it does seem to me that these dehumanizing ideologies of biological determinism, environmental determinism, and I spend a chapter on each of those, by the way, in my book, Death of Humanity. I have a chapter on biological determinism, a chapter on environmental determinism. I also have a chapter on Nietzsche and the existentialists and postmodernists and their views and how that dehumanizes, leads to dehumanization. And one thing that I show is that all of these philosophies lead to the view that human life has no value, no purpose, nothing beyond what we just create of ourselves. And so, in fact, I wrote an article not too long ago about atheists finding meaning in life, but the meaning that they find in life is just the meaning they create themselves. And so they're not really finding meaning in life. They're just creating whatever meaning they want to. So I argue that's just like a fairy tale. They're just creating it themselves. Yeah, I can create my own meaning for life, but it doesn't have any objective significance beyond what I say it has. So it's not really a meaning or purpose beyond myself. There's nothing transcendent that they can appeal to. And because of this, because they don't believe human life has any intrinsic meaning or purpose, I argue this then opens the door to mass killing of various sorts. And of course, we see the most horrific examples with Nazi Germany and Stalinism and Mao's regimes, as well as other communist regimes in the 20th century. But we also see it in our own society. We have had actual mass shootings on the basis of some of these philosophies, like at the Columbine massacre, which I detail in my book as well. But we also have it on a grander, much larger scale with things like abortion, easy acceptance of abortion, of infanticide, and now assisted suicide becoming more acceptable, euthanasia coming on. And so these, because human life has been devalued by these secular philosophies, it opens the door to these kinds of killing, because certain people are defined as non-persons. So we define the infant in the womb as being a non-person. We define the infant sometimes even after being born. Someone defined as a non-person, so we don't care about killing them. We define people at the end of their life then as being a non-person, especially if they've lost their cognitive abilities. And so we've devalued human life so that we think life only has value if there's certain traits that are present there, and other people who don't have those traits, well, we can just kill them as we please. And so these dehumanizing ideologies have had some pretty profound impact on mass destruction. By the way, if you want to talk about mass destruction, abortion has killed between 1 and 2 billion babies since the 1970s. That figure is worldwide. That's not a U.S. figure. The U.S. figure is somewhere around 60 million, if I recall correctly. But the figure worldwide is somewhere between 1 and 2 billion babies have been killed by abortion since the 1970s. So we're talking about mass destruction that's taken place based on these dehumanizing ideologies. So now, real briefly, what should our response be? Well, first of all, I think we need to examine these views and understand them, to understand where secularists are coming from, and also to understand that each of these three views, biological determinism, environmental determinism, and this free will, radical free will view of Nietzsche, they all have some elements of truth. There are ways in which heredity affects us. There are ways in which our environment and upbringing affect us. There are ways in which we have free will to make choices. But all three of them are true at the same time. We don't have to choose one of those. And also, there's something true beyond that, that there's a spiritual reality beyond that we as Christians understand and know. So, but the problem is when people focus on one of those and absolutize that, then they end up with this dehumanizing ideology. I think also, as we examine these views, we need to point out to our secular colleagues the tensions between their views that do devalue human life and their notion that human life does have value, because most secularists actually do believe that human life has value. And if you look at what they write and say about human value, you find that this is the case. One of the most fascinating examples of this I came across as I was studying Death of Humanity was Bertrand Russell, who did believe that human life had value. In fact, that's why he was campaigning against nuclear arms. He was part of the nuclear disarmament movement, even spent a little time in jail for protesting against nuclear arms. And why does he want to protest nuclear arms? Because he realizes that human life has value. On the other hand, if you look at his own philosophy, Russell said very forthrightly that there is no value or significance or purpose to human life. So I think we should try to point out these tensions in secularist thought to try to get them to understand that, yes, human life does have value, but your secular philosophy doesn't give you any reason to think that it should have value. And hopefully they will give up on their secularist viewpoint rather than on their view that human life has value. Interestingly, I'll close with this one. There's a book that came out just a couple of years ago by John Evans, a sociologist, a secular sociologist at the University of California, San Diego, called What is a Human? And then he asked what the answer had to do with human rights. And Evans did this surveys in which he shows, interestingly, that religious world, what he calls a theological worldview, which is basically a Judeo-Christian worldview of humans being created in the image of God, actually is a stronger foundation for, well, he wouldn't say stronger foundation. He says that people who embrace that view have a greater chance of embracing human rights than people who embrace secular viewpoints. And he has two major viewpoints that he looks at, one of which he calls a biological worldview, which is the view that basically Darwinian account of biological determinism and such. And the other one is what he calls a philosophical view, by which he means basically Peter Singer's view of personhood theory and such. But what he shows is that people that believe in Christianity and the theological view, and he's doing this in the context of the United States, so it's mostly Christianity that's these theological views, that they have higher respect for human rights than do people with the secular viewpoint, which is exactly what I have predicted in my own writings and have suggested. In fact, Evans actually cites my work from Darwin to Hitler when in the introduction to the book, where he's talking about different viewpoints relating to these things. But Evans, unfortunately, refuses to acknowledge that maybe these secular viewpoints are wrong. Maybe they need to have that foundation in order to support human rights. Evans still wants to support human rights, but he doesn't, in my view, have any foundation for it in his own secular philosophies. Okay, so let's just open it up for discussion now. I basically have laid out most of the ideas here, and I know there's lots of avenues we could go here. So let's go ahead and open it up now for time question and answers or discussion, whatever you want to add or or have to say to me. Be glad to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, as you said, now it's time for questions. So please feel free to write it down on the chat, or to just turn your mic on and ask Richard. Maybe as they write or they say something, I will start with one question.
Okay.
So how would you recommend, or how are some practical steps how we can engage these ideologies, these ideas, when we encounter them in conversation, in some discussion? What would be some recommendations from you?
Well, first of all, I think I suggest we need to sort of become conversant in them. And this is one thing that I think Francis Schaeffer did a tremendous job of in L'Abri. He was able, because he knew the philosophies that many of the young people were being taught at the universities, and when they would come to him and such, he knew what the ideas were, at least in their basics. And again, we don't need to necessarily study in depth every single one of these, but it helps to know sort of the general contours. And that's why in my book of Death of Humanity, I've tried to sort of lay out what the general contours are of the modern thought. So once we know those ideas, then when we start hearing some of these ideas, we can start sort of probing. And I think one of the best things to do is ask questions. Ask a lot of questions of the person to try to find out what they believe. And again, try to find out where there may be tensions within their own viewpoint. So again, if they're coming from the viewpoint of evolutionary psychology, they think that humans, the human intellect and ideas and thoughts are simply a product of our evolutionary background, then we could start asking them, well, okay, what about morality? Where does morality come from? Oh, then they would probably say, oh, morality just comes from evolution too. And so they'd give this evolutionary account of morality. And then we could start trying to press them about different moral issues, And in fact, some people like Justin Brierley have done a good job of this too. Justin Brierley has a program called Unbelievable. And he was interviewing Richard Dawkins one time, and he was pressing him on the issue of rape. And Dawkins actually came out and basically said, well, no, there's nothing objectively wrong with it. Brierley had to really press to get him to say that, because Dawkins didn't want to say that. But Dawkins finally had to admit that based on his own philosophical views, that rape is neither right nor wrong. There's nothing moral about it. Dawkins said himself, there's no such thing as good, there's no such thing as evil. So I think we need to try to press people on the issues, on moral issues, because most people do have moral commitments of one sort or another. Their morality may be completely diametrically opposed to Christian morality, but they do have moral views very often. And you press progressives, they have very strong moral views, in fact. And here at my university, for example, there's very intense hatred for the alt-right and for white nationalism and such. And I'm also diametrically opposed to those things. But they do think there's something that is, and I would go so far as to say, if you really start talking, they do think that there is something objectively wrong with that. They don't just think it's, oh, you can choose that if you want to. They wouldn't say that. So I think we can try to discuss with them and ask questions and find out where they're coming from in different moral issues. What is morally important to them? And then pose those things and say, well, okay, if this is something morally important to you, let's say global warming could be an issue. If global warming is an important issue to you, why is that an important issue to you? Well, and press them, is it because it would harm people? Well, what's wrong with harming people? If there's no purpose or value in human life, what's wrong with harming people? What should it matter? Who cares if the human species gets wiped out by, an extinction in the future? So there's all these different things I think we can try to ask questions to find out where they're coming from morally, and try to show them that their morality probably doesn't match their philosophy, because their philosophy, a secularist philosophy, usually is that there is no morality. So that's how I sort of approach it.
Are there any books or any other literature? Obviously, your book on the modern thought, you were saying, I don't remember the title right now. If you can repeat it.
The Death of Humanity, is that what you're talking
about?
Oh,
The Death of Humanity. Yeah. Yes, you talk about these topics more in depth, probably.
Yes.
Are there any other literature or resources you would recommend?
Yeah, well, there are quite a number of books that deal with similar kinds of issues, and a lot of works in Christian apologetics and such. Uh, I noticed that J.P. Moreland has a book that's coming out. I haven't read it, so I can't really recommend it in the full sense, but J.P. Moreland has a book. I do respect his work. I've read his other works, a number of his other works that he put out in the past. He has a book that's coming out about scientism. I think it's supposed to be out in about 2 weeks or so, and it sounds like a very interesting study, so I'm guessing that would be a good resource. Nancy Pearcey has written a number of things. Nancy Pearcey was converted through Francis Schaeffer's ministry at L'Abri, and she's written quite a number of things that look at the way that modern thought has contributed to the dehumanization process and such, and some of the same kinds of issues that I cover in my book, Death of Humanity. Her book, Saving Leonardo, looks at sort of the angle of art and the fine arts and how they've been, how they reflect the dichotomy between the secular realm on the one hand and morality, religion, and such on the other side, which is our society sort of tried to create this divide between the two. She does a really masterful job, I think, of showing how fine arts reflect that reality. And then in a more recent book called Love Thy Body, she deals with some of these same issues. She does touch on the issues of abortion and euthanasia, which I also touch on, but she also expands that to touch on other issues such as sexual immorality, such as homosexuality, transgenderism, and such. And so Nancy Pearcey's book, Love Thy Body, is really a fantastic look at some of the biggest problems that are facing our society and that we as Christians are having to grapple with in our day, I would say.
So Paul wrote, okay, he writes, Richard, I greatly enjoyed the talk. Sorry, I don't have any questions.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Great having you on board.
So thank you very much for your time and your presentation. I think it was very interesting to learn a little more about how we got here, how modern thought has impacted and has evolved through the different thinkers and how it came to be. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you also for your comments on how to engage this modern thought today in our ministries, in our conversations. So thank you very much. Thank you very much all that you attended. Soon we will have this recording online, so I will be sure to send it to you so that you can come back to it if you need it. Also, if you agree, Richard, we could also send the PowerPoint presentation if they want to look it back.
Sure, I'd be fine doing that.
And if you want to attend another webinar, there are more upcoming webinars in September and the next month. So feel free to go to focalonline.org and check the different webinars that we're offering. And this is all for today. So once again, thank you very much. Thank you very much,
Yeah,
Richard.
thanks for having me on.
I hope we see you again.
Okay.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.